So, what a historic day today has ended up being. Of course, if you are a Liverpool fan, which I happen to be, it is, a first for the club, their first Premier League title since the advent of, the Premier League era, a phenomenal achievement. If you're a football purist, you may hate Liverpool, but, I think we can all say the way Liverpool plays football, at least to the neutral, or even to the opposition fan who likes to watch, good quality football, was absolutely deserving. But, more importantly, an absolutely huge day for Australian football, with the Women's World Cup in 2023 being awarded to Australia and New Zealand. Of course, they will be co-hosts. Of course, as Japan was knocked out of the race, I believe another country came before them. It was Australia and Colombia. The doubters came out in full force. There was, fear that football corruption at FIFA was once again about to rear its ugly head. To be honest, I wasn't exactly sure, what my feelings on those sort of thoughts were. But I'll tell you what I did sort of believe was, unlike the previous men's World Cup bid, under the chairmanship of Sir Frank Lowy, there's something that was, as a general vibe, this bid felt a little bit different. It didn't feel like, Australia went over the top, in its expenditure. It felt that Australia was, significantly more strategic. The campaign, the As One campaign, which bubbled over some time, probably the hiring of James Johnson from a strategic perspective, I'd say worked in Australia's favour. If we're just looking at it at a surface level, the insight he could give into maybe, FIFA's workings may have helped with the bid, because, when we look at the history of, bad press that FIFA has gotten, the fact that Infantino is a relatively new president, maybe the eyes of the football world, I'd say, were firmly fixed on this decision. And whilst we still saw some block voting, on behalf, especially of, the UEFA block, ultimately, it came out early, it came out, 1 to 2 weeks ago, that Australia, had the best technical score of any bid. Obviously, it is in a growth region of football globally, that being Asia/Oceania. It seemed to have a really, really good vibe about it, and the way that information came out, it almost felt that, the layperson who may not know about FIFA's workings, would have been surprised if Australia and New Zealand didn't get the nod. So it was absolutely brilliant to actually see Australia get the nod. I do agree with some sentiment that I've seen, around the internet, that really this is a huge event. Now, I know Peter Filopoulos has gone to the extent of saying, this is arguably the biggest event since the Olympics, and given the growth of football, the general population growth of the world since 2020, you could argue, the biggest event ever held in Australia. That's what Peter put forward. I'm starting to agree with him. I certainly was impressed with the size of the previous or recently completed Women's World Cup. It was a great event. The technical standard was high. The stadia was great. The production values were outstanding. And to have the next evolution of that tournament in Australia is a brilliant thing for the game here, as it will be in New Zealand. But most importantly, the question I think we now need to ask is, what does this mean for Australian football? Now, I think absolutely at a very, very high level, it means that it's an absolutely phenomenal opportunity for, the women's and girls side of the game here in Australia to explode. Now, we are in a fortunate position of obviously having the Matildas, who on a global scale, are considered a top 10 FIFA team. I think they might be ranked, in between, 5th to 7th. Their highest ranking may be slightly higher than that. We have some of the world's best players. So from that perspective, having such a marquee team, is a brilliant thing. It naturally attracts young girls to play the game, but it's going to, that multiplier effect, with I guess the sheer marketing, wave and force that is a FIFA event of this scale being held in your country is probably going to see, women's and girls' interest in the sport explode over the next 2 or 3 years. Now, I think, from a facilities perspective, I'm not expecting major stadia to be built. I don't think that was part of the bid, but absolutely, we've already seen the great work of the member federations of Victoria and Western Australia in announcing, elite football facilities. There's an article that came out today from Mick Lynch indicating that, on top of the 15 million that Victoria had secured in federal government funding for the Home of the Matildas project, that, Peter Philopoulos is trying to get 90 million, a $90 million commitment from the Victorian state government. Now, that would be sensational. We're talking about an over $100 million, training elite, facility. It would be outstanding. Obviously, it would have some sort of, football-specific stadium tied with it as well. Maybe the advent of the Matildas, participating in a World Cup on home soil might mean that, we could even have a bigger stadium out of that. I think it was initially mooted to be 5,000. It'd be great to be able to get a 10,000, seat stadium, specifically, obviously for the international teams of Australia, major Football Victoria events like the NPL Vic final, the Doherty Cup final, when international teams or clubs visit Victoria, perhaps they could be based there. It would be absolutely sensational. So, that's already in the pipeline. I think what we could get as an absolutely huge win would be if the Football Federation of Australia, I like to call them the former Franks FFA, if they can use this opportunity to convert, the old St. George Stadium, into the home of football, have a similar facility, if not a better one than what Victoria has mooted. I think it's going to be very hard to beat because, Victoria is successful in $100 million dollars plus in funding. It's going to take a phenomenal effort from the state of New South Wales to beat that. But if we can get, a home of football facility and also maybe a nice little boutique stadium at the old St. George ground, which of course has some historical value, being the club, of course, that Johnny Warren, I believe, was associated with in his playing days. These are huge wins for Australian football, and obviously the wheels are in motion for some of them, but I think getting this sort of major event is hopefully going to help increase the funding for some, push some other projects over the line, like the Home of Football project in New South Wales, and hopefully at a local council level, with the explosion of the anticipated explosion of women's and girls players, playing the game. Hopefully that allows clubs, and federations, to work with state and local councils, state government and local councils to basically see a facilities, / infrastructure upgrade, improvement in Victoria and throughout the country, over the next 2 or 3 years, on a scale that we've never seen. Now, we've seen some really good projects that are happening in Victoria at the moment. Heidelberg United, I think, is probably the flagship facility, which is currently being upgraded in Victorian football. That's going to be, a sensational venue. But, to have maybe projects not as large as that, but, it's not totally off the cards because, that, I believe, 3-phase project is probably worth 10 to 15 million. You could probably target, 4 or 5, 6 projects over the next 2 or 3 years in each state, to achieve similar funding. And, if Australia was able to pull off, such an infrastructure play, for the sport of football over this period of time, I think that would be the legacy that would come out of this World Cup. It would be probably a silent legacy because we're going to have, great focus on Australia, both in the lead up, during the tournament, slightly after the tournament. The football obviously will take center stage. If the Matildas perform well, that will always be remembered. But, for those who are on the front line of Australian football, if we can really come away from this, with, an explosion of girls and women playing the game, it's already on a large growth curve, and also 3 elite outstanding facilities for football in Victoria, Western Australia, and New South Wales, and 10, 15, 20 council style really good football centre projects like Heidelberg United as an example, we're really going to have a turbo boost, to the game in this country. I would also like to point out that when looking at the new FFA board, I mean, they've obviously been in the role now, I think for quite some time. I think it's approximately a year and a half. Yeah, so the unwinding of NCIP, was really there only, from my perspective, as I said, a fan's perspective, notable achievement. And, as mentioned, the Women's World Cup, many would consider that as an absolutely, remarkable achievement, which it is. I mean, there's absolutely no question. And the current FFA board and all the employees of the organisation and those who worked on the bid team will always be remembered for this significant achievement. But, when I look at how I want, the decision-making to basically play out, within the Australian football landscape, the important decision-making over the next, 2 to 3 years, I think we can use the Women's World Cup as a clear line in the sand. And what I mean by that is, obviously the tournament's going to happen in 2023, and when we combine that, with the unprecedented, and unexpected COVID-19 pandemic, which really, if we're being honest, actually it's not a matter of being honest, it's blatantly obvious. It's brought, the restructure of AFCA's A-League tournament cartel of fake football, which is known as the A-League, forward by at least 2 or 3 years. It clearly was a black swan event, which really showcased, the fact that the A-League was built on a very, very, insecure and superficial base. So when we combine, the opportunity now that pandemic has given us to, think about the future of the game, think about how we structure professional football in this country, combined with the Women's World Cup, which is going to see an enormous amount of momentum and funding going into football, over the next 2 to 3 years. We should be aiming, in my opinion, to utilise these 2 to 3 years to completely overhaul and restructure the game so it's inclusive. So effectively anyone in this country who either participates, supports, volunteers, or simply just, loves the game. For example, you might be someone who just, for example, likes watching European football, but I consider you, if you religiously watch European football, in my opinion, you're someone that really, really likes the game. And you're someone that, the Australian football, family should be targeting to, see if you can be involved in some capacity, outside of just watching European football. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to watch, a game at the professional level. That could be that you become a volunteer at your local club. And I think the only way we're going to really be inclusive and, try and leverage, the large interest of football here in this country, is if we lay out a plan over the next 2 to 3 years, it's going to have to include, some really, really big decisions being made. I'm really keen to see now that the former Franks FFA are in effective, complete control of the FFA Cup. They don't have to worry about Foxtel's requirements. Are they going to improve, that tournament? I've always felt there's, ample opportunity to make it, to effectively expand the national phase to 64 clubs. I think that would just increase the interest. It would give more lower ranked teams the opportunity to have national coverage, and then to also link the tournament, I think, to a spot in the Asian Champions League, which I think was promised as far as back as 2014. So that serves as just an unbelievable example of the self-interest that has plagued Australian football for a long time. But look, in particular, let's be honest, since AFCA's A-League tournament cartel, maybe 3 to 5 years in, I would argue even from the beginning of it, the fact that someone like David Gallup came out and said in 2014 that the FFA Cup, his intention was to give it an ACL spot, and then that was basically buried, shows to me how much politicking is happening in the background in order to prevent, a structural improvement, to Australia's, most, in my opinion, absolutely by far I know the FFA marketed as the only truly national cup competition, which it is, but it's a unique event as well. It is authentic up to a certain point in the way it's structured. As a cup tournament, obviously, there are improvements that need to be made to it. Obviously, the favouring of an NPL team, for example, always making the semi-finals is probably something that should go in a restructure. We should have an open draw, but linking it to the Asian Champions League. Imagine being able to say, to the Australian football public, we actually have a national cup tournament where, the winner, and theoretically any club in Australian football can compete, in this tournament, is going to receive a spot in Asian football. Like, if you're an opposition sport, paying attention to Australian football, you just can't compete against that, And these are the sort of, in my opinion, no-brain decisions that over the next 2 to 3 years, we need to fast track and we need to implement. So, okay, I've just talked about expanding the FFA Cup. We absolutely, in 2021, I want to be saying that, the National Second Division 1 has been announced and is hopefully... the clubs have been selected. It is absolutely vital, in my opinion, that the former Franks FFA prioritise the strongest clubs in Australian football. Now, the strongest clubs in Australian football, may I say existing clubs in Australian football, should have good stadium facilities, existing, pathways for players, ideally a women's team, obviously... an existing fan base is absolutely vital. And the reality is, we're not trying to favour anybody here. The reality is we're just trying to leverage the best possible entrance just initially. Obviously, after that selection is made, it's going to be open up to, on-field results. But initially, we need to get, the strongest teams in. That's just a common sense decision for Australian football. We need to get the teams with the most fans, the best stadiums, the best finances, histories which allow, for example, the media to talk about, a variety of story angles. It's in the best interests of the game to make sure that the National Second Division has the strongest clubs available. So that, I hope, in 2021 will be announced. The clubs will be announced. Hopefully at the latest, we'll have a kickoff date in 2022. It needs to be from day one linked to the state NPL. So we need to aim during this 2 to 3 year period leading up to the Women's World Cup to not only introduce a national second division, we need to make sure it's linked to the state NPLs. So then all of a sudden we have, once again, a unique selling proposition. It sounds like, I'm preaching something that we don't know about, but the reality is, if we had a situation where any club in Australia could work its way to a professional standard, once again, we have a unique selling point. We're being remarkably inclusive because, again, any club can strive to get to that point. And just think about it. A club that starts, playing low in the state leagues, if they have a good run over 10, 20 years and eventually work their way up to being a professional club in Australia, they're going to have, a fan base. They're going to have unbelievable history. They're probably going to have great facilities, both training and a reasonable stadium. This is the sort of cycle of Australian football, organic development and growth that we need to position the game for. If we're going to set it up for success, it's vital. And I would also say that aside from linking it to the NPLs, and okay, if there's issues around, those initial clubs want some security, again, the decision is, for me, quite straightforward. You announce the second division. Maybe you started off with 14 teams, and the first 2 years are simply going to be promotion only from the NPL, right? So we get to a situation where we have 16 clubs, and then from the third year, relegation comes into play, from the second division to the state NPL level. Thirdly, it would be an absolutely iconic moment if, the former Franks FFA, and, I have faith in what I'm seeing so far from James Johnson, and hopefully the former Franks FFA board is on board with this idea as well. It would be such an inclusive move for them to come out and say, you know what, we realise, AFCA's A-League tournament cartel of fake football, needs to get bigger. We also realise that, we've tried franchises, and let's be truthful, unless you're a fake football McFranchise playing in a major city, i.e. Melbourne or Sydney, and you're playing in a monopoly, the concept of geographic regions and catchment areas, for me, is an absolute failure. And you would have to argue night and day, and eventually concede that you're not going to change my view on that. I even look at Sydney FC, who are currently on top of Africa's A-League tournament, capitalise football, I think by 8 points. They've had a good team for a number of years. They get lauded for playing in, I guess, boutique style arenas in Sydney suburbs. But the reality is they're averaging, I think, 12,109 patrons a game. And they're clearly on top, and they've had a sustained period of success for a number of years. What happens if Sydney FC was positioned outside of, the top 6 for 1 year or 2 years or 3 years? Are they all of a sudden, a fake football McFranchise in arguably Australia's largest geographic region and catchment area, that is metropolitan Sydney? Are they going to be averaging only 4,000 to 6,000 people? I think that's highly likely. And that, to me, is the perfect example of how, geographic regions and catchment areas, made from thin air entities being parachuted into the top flight of Australian football doesn't work. So I recommend the former Franks FFA board, work with James Johnson to announce, leading up to the World Cup, that we're going to expand both the W League and the A-League, via the National Second Division. And what I didn't mention was, when I was talking about the National Second Division, was that we need to also set one up for women. This opportunity that the Women's World Cup provides the game, in parallel, when creating the National Second Division for men, we need one for women. We are obviously more advanced in the development of top quality players, in the women's side of the game. We have an opportunity to consolidate that and really ensure for, hopefully decades to come, that if structurally we're set up correctly, leading up to obviously the Women's World Cup, if we have an integrated pyramid for women as well, we're going to be, an absolutely dominant nation, in my opinion, in the women's side of the game. Hopefully, for as long as we'd like, really. So it would be great for the former Franks FFA to come out and say, in 2023, we would love the symbolism of being able to say that the first club was promoted from National Second Division into Africa's A-League tournament of cartel of fake football. I'm proposing that relegation from the top division doesn't occur immediately, in order to, try work in with, the McFranchise owners. And I think it's only fair, you have 4 years of promotion, so you get the top division to 16 teams. And then, in the 5th year of the fully integrated pyramid, which is obviously going to be after the 2023 World Cup, you're going to have promotional relegation from the top division down. And I think, that would really set an unbelievable grounding and framework, for the game to move forward, capitalising on the investment that's going to come from the 2023 World Cup. We're going to get unbelievable exposure. We're going to get, the women's game turbocharged. Why not, use the COVID-19 pandemic, which I believe, the former Franks FFA and James Johnson, have been using with, the announcement of gradually moving to winter, taking control of the FFA Cup rights, talking about a transfer window. It looks like we're moving that direction. So let's continue moving that direction. Let's put the marker in the sand of the 2023 World Cup. Let's have people coming to this country for the World Cup, and, they may initially be coming thinking like, Australia, New Zealand hosting the World Cup is going to be similar to, say, when the USA hosted, the 94 World Cup. It was a fledgling, I guess, football nation, and they were relying on the World Cup to really try and improve their football culture. What I say is Australia has a significantly far more advanced football culture than a country like the United States, in my opinion. Let's get our game overhauled and structurally correct. So when people come here en masse, we can show that we're actually a football nation and not just a football host. I hope you enjoyed this. That's Mike's take.